Good evening, and welcome to this Los Angeles World Affairs Council event on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Looking forward to protecting tomorrow's digital world. I'm Dr. Richard Downey. I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and we're very happy that you could join us. But I have to begin tonight by saying that on behalf of all of us at the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, our hearts go out to so many that have been involved and affected by the fires that are raging all over Los Angeles today and yesterday. For those of you, I'm sure you're watching this, but there are many who are beyond the LA area who may not realize there are hundreds of people who have lost homes. There are thousands, many thousands that have been evacuated, many injured and died. So it's been a very sad day for all of us here in Los Angeles, our members, our families, and this community. So again, our hearts go out to all of those. But thank you for being with us tonight. I want to apologize to all of you who were registered to go to the in-person event at RAND. We really were looking forward to that. But today, about noon, the RAND Corporation made the decision that due to the heavy smoke from the fires, they closed the RAND building today and tomorrow. So we really had to, on short notice, do what we could. So we reverted to this live stream event, which we're very happy that you are joining us for. It's just so you're aware, we had to, it was too late to cancel the catering. So you'll be happy to know we were not able to waste it. The food that you would have been eating has been sent to the crews at the Eaton Fire. So we at least were able to do that. We will refund the price of your tickets for the inconvenience, or we'd happy to give you a voucher to some of our upcoming events. We have some great events on the way. Next week, we have an event on Syria with former U.S. Ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford. We have the Dan Schnorr Political Report. These are 15th and 16th. Just highlighting a few that we have coming up. We have a lot more, but on the 6th of February, we're doing an event with the Los Angeles Diplomatic Corps. It should be very nice. On the 26th of February, we have an event with the new police chief, McDonald, on again, 26th of February, the new LA police chief. Now, by the way, for those of you who are so inclined, we are a poor nonprofit. We're unfortunately going to lose about $4,000 as a result of not being able to do this in person. So if you would like to donate the price of your ticket, or for those of you who didn't have a chance to register, we'd be happy to take a donation from you, and we'd be delighted to send you receipt for a tax-deductible contribution. So we would certainly welcome that for those of you who don't want to get a refund or a voucher, but delighted to do that. So I needed to let you know we want you to be a part of this event. You're an important part of this conversation. You can go down to the bottom of your screen and go to the Q&A function down there, and you can write a question at any time throughout. But the first 25 minutes or so will be our moderator, Dr. James Chow, and our speaker, Admiral Michael Rogers. But after that, we'll be focused on your questions. Our communications manager, Madison Alt, will take your questions and pass those to Dr. Chow to get those answered. So please, anytime throughout the program, you can send in your questions and answers. And now let me introduce our moderator and our speaker. Our moderator for tonight, and by the way, I should mention Dr. James Chow. We can't thank you and Admiral Rogers enough for your flexibility. Dr. Chow, you've for those of you in our audience, Dr. Chow, I mentioned that there are many evacuees. Dr. Chow and his family are among those. So we just can't thank you enough for being with us tonight, Dr. Chow, for this. And Dr. Chow is the Vice President and Director of the Air Force Project at RAND. He's also a senior engineer at RAND. He specializes in Air Force planning, in weapons systems, as well as air defense modeling. He's been the chairman of the Air Force's Scientific and Advisory Board, and he got his PhD in aeronautics and astronomics from Stanford University. We're delighted to have you tonight, Dr. Chow, as our moderator. Thank you. And Admiral Michael Rogers, he's a retired four-star admiral who spent 37 years of service in the United States Navy. His culminated his career as the director of the National Security Agency, NSA. He was also the commander of the U.S. Cyber Command. He spent time as the director of intelligence for the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as the Indo-Pacific Command. He's currently serving on many boards of directors and advisory boards for private security companies. And he is an international speaker on around the world, as well as on many global media outlets on issues of cyber technology, as well as global security issues. And we are just thrilled to have both of you tonight for this discussion. Dr. Chow, let me turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for that, Richard. And everybody, happy to host this. Mike, it's my pleasure and honor to have this opportunity to talk to you again.
Thanks, James. Thank you.
Wish we could be meeting in person with the audience.
Yeah, well, let me just second for everybody what the Chow family is going through. To have to evacuate your home and then just watch remotely, hoping that your home is fine, your neighbors are safe, their homes are fine.
Yeah.
Boy, that's got to be wearing. Hope you guys are doing okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, yeah, a lot of folks in LA facing a similar situation. But look, I'm at the bottom line. I'm glad we were able to flex to have this discussion, because this is a really important, topical, consequential discussion on the intersection between AI and cybersecurity. So I'd like to dive right in, Mike, and help our audience really better understand the issues. I'll say that I think we're all now familiar with the troubling cybersecurity incidences that pop up in the news periodically, unfortunately, frequently. And so I guess my starting question is just to set the context on the cybersecurity aspect. How do you see the evolution of the threat evolving? And then what do you see as the most significant risks that are being posed to both the public and to governmental interests in the future?
So first of all, the thing I'm struck by is, number one, the aggressiveness of the actors out there, whether they be nation states like China and Russia, Iran, North Korea, whether they be criminal groups, many of whom are in Russia or Eastern Europe. They are largely becoming both more capable. They have more capacity because they're making significant investments in cyber, because their ability to penetrate networks for a variety of different purposes is proving to be highly advantageous, and in their minds is creating good outcomes for them, whether you're a criminal group that's focused on generating money through ransomware, whether you're a nation state like China focused on stealing intellectual property or accessing and placing at risk critical infrastructure like parts of the power grid, which we saw. And now the latest ongoing incident, what we call Salt Typhoon, Chinese penetration of the telecommunications backbone in the United States. I mean, think about that. We now have a nation state that has penetrated our telecommunication system and accessed phone content, text content, all the call data records, which tell you what numbers are calling what numbers in the United States. So that gives them a sense of activity. And then the fourth area of concern with the telecommunications backbone is they have also likely gained access to what we call the lawful intercept arena. What does that mean? When the United States government decides that it has evidence to believe that espionage or national security activity is being conducted by foreign entities, it goes to a court, it gets a warrant, and that court warrant gives it the authority to collect phone information on targeted individuals. We call that lawful intercept. The Chinese are interested in acquiring that because that gives you a sense for who is the United States targeting, who are they suspicious of, What kind of methodology are the Americans using to generate this knowledge? I mean, that's really problematic. So broadly, you're seeing these criminals, these nation states, more capability, more capacity, and most alarming at all to me, and I would argue you specifically see this with China's activity, much more aggressive. If you had told me when I left the military, 6 years ago, I ran the two largest cyber organizations in the US government in NSA and Cyber Command. And if you had told me when I left government 6 years ago that, for example, a nation state would place destructive malware in parts of the US electrical power grid, I would have said highly unlikely. There would really have to be some sort of background crisis, really heightened level of anxiety between our nations, that would be so escalatory and so aggressive that no nation would do it. And yet we've caught the Chinese placing destructive malware, specifically programs designed to be activated to destroy the ability of the power grid to actually function. Had they done something like place dynamite under bridges in the United States to stop our ability to use our road infrastructure, we call that an act of war under the traditional definitions we use. But because this was done through malware or software programs, we're treating it differently. That's an interesting discussion in and of itself. Hey, is that the right approach? But bottom line, the risk appetite of all these actors is growing. They are willing to be even more aggressive. So you combine that willingness to be more aggressive, capacity, capability, that's a bad vector for where we're going.
That's sobering. And it seems like just a foot stomp. It seems like it's cost effective for them. Like what they're trying to do, it doesn't seem like I don't know. I'm interested in your thoughts.
No,
Maybe
I think one of the reasons you're seeing this pattern is all of these actors, whether it's those nation states we talked about, those criminal groups, what they are finding is their activity is generating advantage at a very low cost or a reasonable cost in their minds. And quite frankly, the West's efforts to forestall it have been broadly ineffective. Now, I define ineffective as it's, for example, 2024, we're going to find highest ransomware rates amount paid to criminal groups in history. With Salt Typhoon, which is this Chinese penetration, for example, of the telecommunications network in the United States, I would argue that arguably that's the most impactful cyber event we've ever had. Now, it's not quite getting that kind of attention, in part because it is so significant. Both the companies and the government have broadly opted to be relatively quiet and relatively measured. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying no one should draw from that, well, this doesn't seem to be all that significant. That is not.
Yeah.
When, for example, the government warns us, don't use text, shift to secure apps like WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram. You pick the secure app that you're comfortable with. To me, that is a huge wake-up call. I'm thinking to myself, the government is actually telling us we can no longer have a high level of assurance of the security of our texting. I mean, that really ought to sober us.
Yeah.
How did we get here?
Hey, coming from you, that is particularly sobering. So you would know. And so, okay, so this is a big deal. The cybersecurity environment, the vector, as you say, is incredibly concerning. And so let me layer on top of that AI. So we hear about new AI advances, seems like an announcement every week. And I'll say personally, I use it as a tool in a number of use cases, right? I mean, I'll say, including to prep for today's event, I used AI. But in today's, program context, how do you see AI transforming the cybersecurity landscape now and in the future?
So look, let's start by what is AI simplistically. It's a set of technologies that enable us to generate new learning from existing data. that we can take this data that we already have and learn even more new insights and knowledge and generate new knowledge from it. Think about the implications of that and the fact that it's done autonomously by a machine, not a human, and at the speed and capacity and level of effort. It is mind-blowing, the changes that AI will generate for us. And they're not all bad. AI, I think, is going to prove to be, like most disruptive technologies, double-edged. There'll be great positives to it. It makes our everyday lives easier. Think about, as James, as you highlighted, you're preparing for something, you're trying to create new knowledge, you're trying to figure out answers to questions, and you go to Chat GPT, pick the engine that you like, and you're just asking it, hey, I have the following question that I don't know or don't understand. Could you define this for me? Or how would you answer the following? And it comes back in many cases. Now, don't forget, there's still some things we got to learn here. So I always urge everybody, just because you got an AI generated answer doesn't mean it is always the perfect one. But it's another source for us to consider. Where we're seeing this in cybersecurity is, like in many areas, so far, I would argue, AI is being used more aggressively by attackers than defenders at the moment. I think that's going to change over time. So I'm watching attackers use AI, for example, to write code very quickly to say, hey, look, here's a particular network configuration. What is a malware sequence that would help me gain access against this defensive capacity and capability? Can you write me a software program that'll do that for me? AI is doing some amazing things in code generation, software code generation, for example. AI is doing some amazing things in, hey, look, I'm studying the telecommunications network backbone. What areas might be most vulnerable to particular cyber activity? I mean, you will get some interesting opinions out of AI, again, that help you focus your efforts. On the same token, increasingly over time, I think you're going to see it used more and more on the defensive side, which I think is important. Just as we should use this as a tool, to generate knowledge about how you penetrate networks, which I did for a living, as well as I also defended networks for a living. So I was very interested in, hey, how can we get smarter as defenders? How can we anticipate what the attacker is going to do? What strategies are they going to employ? What might their malware, what might their tactics look like? AI offers some great modeling and simulation perspectives from a defender's perspective. Hey, what should I be planning for? What strategies might an adversary use against me? Gives you some really interesting insights if you're willing to use it. And you are seeing Salt Typhoon is really interesting. When the US government first discovered this Chinese activity in the telecommunications backbone, one of the things that the Chinese pivoted to a very different strategy this time to penetrate the network. In this case, they used a tactic we call living off the land. They decided one of the ways to not get caught is to generate a strategy in which, once we access the network, we want to make sure that our operations and our activity look exactly like normal activity. Because most cyber defense strategies are predicated on the idea that activity of concern will somehow be different. Mm-hmm. And you look for the differences as the way to highlight, that's different, that's unusual, I haven't seen that before. I really need to focus on that as a network defender, as a network owner. Most cybersecurity strategies tend to start from a premise that one of the fundamental strategies of cyber defense is look for the differences, look for activity that you don't expect to see in that area. The Chinese know that. And it's interesting to watch them pivot to, hey, look, we're going to change our operational profile to blend in. We're going to take that cyber tool away from them. We're not going to look different. We're going to maximize the way we blend in, and we're going to make it harder. So one of the things, for example, that NSA did was, as they were studying this, they used AI to ask if an adversary was going to attempt to penetrate a network and model the network's activities as part of their attacker strategy, would there be indicators that a defender could look for? And it actually gave them a couple things that they had not. So I've heard from them, from my old team. It actually gave them a few things, that we hadn't thought about before, but AI highlighted to us. These are particular areas where you might still be able to determine some measure of unusualness. So on the positive side, I thought, hey, it's a great use by a defender. That's great to see.
Yeah, you mentioned that use of AI is more prolific on the offense side. Why is that? Can you talk about what challenges do you see in implementing AI solutions?
So number one, for a lot of attackers out there, breaking China, so to speak, to them is just the cost of doing business. They don't care about inadvertent damage. They don't care about potentially hitting the wrong target. For me, for example, as doing offensive kinds of things and penetrating networks for our nation, I was always mindful, and the leadership of our nation would always be very specific with me about, so Mike, if we approve a specific set of targets, it's those targets and nothing else. We cannot impact something unintended. And so we would set great store, and our strategies are always predicated on, we were always going to be very specific. We were not willing to take excessive risk with the view that that might lead to inadvertent collateral damage. And that was always unacceptable to us. But for most attackers, quite frankly, that doesn't tend to shape them as much. So their sense of risk is much lower. They'll view that. So they're willing to use AI as hey, just tell me what's in the technical feasible. I don't care about should I do it. I just care about can I do it and would it work?
Yeah. Okay. So then to bring it back to the AI part of the discussion, and there is a form of this question, which is put aside AI, but who has the advantage, the offense or the defense? And so I know AI, it's still kind of an emerging area, but how do you see the tea leaves? Well, let me start with without AI, where do you see this going? And then with AI, where do you see this going?
So I would say right now, broadly, the advantages to the attacker. And I say this as an individual, both penetrated as well as defended for a living. For an attacker, the number of options open to you is much broader. As a defender, you have to get so many different dimensions of cybersecurity just right. As an attacker, you've only got to get access, just given the way network architecture works for most networks. You've just got to find one weakness, and generally, depending on the nature of what you're trying to achieve and the nature of the network. But generally, you get in one area, you can move pretty broadly if you're good at what you do. So as an attacker, it was always easier, to be honest, than as a defender. If you overlay AI, the fact that right now applications are a little uneven, I think still shows that the attacker has the advantage. Where I'm hoping is that increasingly over time, in the near term, that AI represents a defensive component that might change the current dynamic, that might restore the balance a little bit more. I mean, that's what I hope.
Yeah. I mean, this does tie into kind of our way, I'm going to say our US kind of way of thinking about this, and segue this into kind of a part of the discussion that I think is important, which is sort of the ethical and policy challenges associated with the use of AI in cybersecurity. I mean, there's a policy and ethical challenges with AI and on cybersecurity, but here on that intersection, and there's privacy concerns, and there's I've heard you talk about some of these things in terms of privacy concerns and regulations, but maybe you can talk a bit more about that for the audience.
I think for a lot of people, there's concerns like, okay, as we're developing this AI generated knowledge, help me understand what's the data that fed it. I want to understand the sources and their reliability, and I want to understand what sort of data was used to do this. I want to make sure that I understand what if any, parameters have you put on the outcomes? AI at times is a good example to me of just because you're given a set of potential answers, it doesn't mean that you should always take the action those answers recommend. That's where you get into the moral, the ethical, you get into, hey, right versus wrong. And those are always significant. Now, it's in cybersecurity, you broadly are not talking about life, limb, and the health of and well-being of individuals. I'm not trying to minimize it. As a military guy in the department, you know, when I was in uniform, we spent a lot of time, and we continue to spend a lot of time asking ourselves about the implications of AI in the application of kinetic force. And I would argue in the application of non-kinetic force, like malware programs, for example, as well. What are the ethical dimensions, and how much oversight control do you have a man or woman in the decision loop, or you have such confidence level that whatever solution sets AI is generating for you, you automatically implement them, you don't review them, you don't question them, etc. And that goes to what kind of level of confidence do you have, what controls. Again, cybersecurity is slightly different. We're not talking about life and limb like we are in the decision about, hey, should we drop a bomb? Now, on the other hand, AI generating knowledge, for example, that's going to take out the power grid, and suddenly we got hospitals, for example, that have no power. Hey, there are potential dimensions to this. So I'm not trying to minimize it. I'm just trying to put it in a little bit of context compared to the kinetic world.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I am going to hand it over or start fielding questions from the audience pretty soon. But maybe just one last question on my end. We've been talking a lot about from the government side, but I know you just for today's event you just flew in from Israel.
Yeah.
And I think you're talking to companies. You work with companies on cybersecurity challenges too. And so again, given this evolving AI context, how should governments, companies, academia, what should they be doing differently, maybe in concert with each other to better protect interests?
So first of all, one of the things that makes AI very interesting to me, it's the first technology in my lifetime that I can remember that even as it was being developed largely in the private sector, not government, those same developers are very quickly coming to the government saying, look, you have got to regulate this. You have got to control this. There needs to be some level of oversight. You just do not normally, if you look at the history of technology, you do not normally find many instances where technical developers then go to the government to say, hey, we're concerned about this. You need to develop some sort of control or oversight. That is really unusual. And yet that's what we found with AI. If you go back 18, 24 months, think about the testimony before Congress by many developers and startups and large companies that were putting significant resources into AI technical development, arguing that, hey, some were arguing we need to create an AI an AI oversight organization, an agency within the government. You just don't normally hear that from the private sector. And the other thing that makes this really challenging to me is, so if you believe the government has a role in oversight, governance, regulation, etc., how do we expect the government to regulate a technology set for which it has little deep knowledge, little direct experience in the development of it, and little direct experience in its applications? And I'm not trying to in any way say the government's bad here, but it's not the center of innovation within AI. It's not the center of development within AI, and it's not the center of utilization of AI within this ecosystem in the United States. It highlights to me that as we think about technical oversight, and we're talking about AI now, but we're going to have these same issues with quantum, et cetera. What does a regulatory or oversight model look like for technologies in which the government is not the primary driver? And in fact, the government is responding. This is not like the nuclear world, for example, where, remember, the the splitting of the atom, nuclear fission, was done as part of a government program.
Yep.
It was controlled by the government from the very beginning. And as we developed the capability through government, through the Manhattan Project, the government then created the Atomic Energy Commission. It created oversight and control mechanisms. That model doesn't really exist with respect to most current technologies. The government just plays a different role today. And I think that's a challenge for us to work our way through. How does government execute oversight and governance? And what should that role look like? How do we combine the expertise, perspective, and knowledge of the government, the private sector development, the academic think tanks? How do we bring all this together to create an ecosystem that both enhances the ability of this technology to generate positive outcomes for us, that increases our confidence as a society that, hey, we have something we understand, we have a level of oversight and control, and we should feel confident that it is being used in positive, non-destructive ways in a manner consistent with the values of the society that it's a part of. I mean, in
Yeah,
a
very
perfect
good.
world, that's what we want to be able to say.
Yeah. And you've highlighted an issue that we weren't able to get to very deeply here, but it really does get to the technical workforce and expertise. And it's not just, as you highlight, in AI and cybersecurity. I mean, I think kind of the model has shifted from a government developed technology. You mentioned nuclear weapons, but there's other examples in the past, and now innovation and tech development really being driven by the commercial world. So
yeah. And if I could, one other thing about, look, AI is significant in that it is disruptive and it is game changing. But if we step back, I worry a little bit that at times I hear AI fundamentally changes everything and turns the world unrecognizable. And I remember that's exactly the way when we created nuclear fission, for example. Remember, at the time, we said to ourselves, we have created the most powerful technology the world has ever seen that has resulted in the development of the most powerful weapon the world has ever seen. This will do away with wars. This will do away with large conventional militaries, and it will redefine the way we describe or ascribe power within this global set of nation state players. Because at the time, the thinking was nation states would control it and only nation states would have access to the technology. And yet, over the course of the subsequent 50 years, we were able to gain some level of control over its usage. We took we took a technology that was developed specifically to create the greatest weapon the world had ever seen, to end the greatest global conflict the world had ever seen. And within a decade, we decided we could use this to propel ships at sea. We could use this to generate electrical power for our society. So we found that there were positive usages to a technology that we developed for a very specific warfare-oriented set of capabilities that fundamentally scared many of the people alive at the time. And so I just urge people, look, we will get through this and we will learn to live with this, and I believe, and we will create an environment in which we're comfortable. But we've had disruptive technologies before. We're going to have them again in the future. We got some challenges, there's no doubt about it, but I remain positive that we're going to be able to deal with these challenges.
Copy. Hey, I'm going to get to the questions now, and I'm going to start with kind of a fun one. And it was kind of at the top of my mind as we started out. And it is kind of your background, because I think we all track in, we've read your bio before, Mike. And so the first question is, how does a Chicagoland kid end up at Auburn, of all places, for college? And how has the trajectory of your career changed over the course of your life? That's
a very good question. And Auburn, so that's Central Alabama in the 1970s. I always wanted to be a naval officer. Literally, I told my parents when I was 11 years old in the 6th grade, I was going to drive ships for a living, which is what I did for the first 6 of my 37 years in the Navy. So I was going to go to the Naval Academy, except my grades weren't good enough. and I couldn't get in the Naval Academy. And I thought, well, I'm going to get an ROTC scholarship with the Navy, except my grades weren't good enough. And I come from a very working class family. Neither of my parents were college graduates. My father worked 4 jobs when I was a kid growing up. He's the hardest working guy. You know, I love and respect my father. I watch how hard he worked to create a better life for his family. And I always thought, hey, I need to try to live up to that kind of standard. And so my parents always told me, Michael, we think education is important, but you're going to have to help us here. We're not going to be able to do all this. And so I couldn't get a scholarship through the ROTC, but I wanted to join the Navy. So I thought, well, could I go to a university where I might not get a scholarship, but if I could at least take ROTC classes? So quite frankly, I was very concerned about cost. So Auburn, for a variety of reasons, became very attractive. And as I kid my Naval Academy friends, because then who knew that 37 years after I graduated from Auburn, I'd be a 4-star admiral. And the 4 stars in the Navy meet twice a year or so. And of the 10 of us, I think I was the only one who was not a Naval Academy graduate. And they would all love to, as we were at times waiting for briefings and presentations to start, they would all love to talk about their life within their company at the Naval Academy or football that particular year. And I said, well, guys, hey, I couldn't get into the Naval Academy, but I decided to go to a place where we really played football. We call it the Southeastern Conference. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to switch gears to a pretty a deep dive question here. So often the weakest link in cybersecurity boundary for companies is the user-human interface, right? And so AI is rapidly helping attackers exploit the human risk by making user-focused attacks more sophisticated. How do you think AI might help the defensive posture in that calculus?
So AI is help from an attacker's perspective. I very much agree with the question. From an attacker's perspective, you're watching adversaries use AI to help social engineer, model, and simulate what particular vectors will potential targets, humans, respond to. What would they be inclined to actually click on, to open? What would be effective in reaching them, so to speak? I think likewise, it's a great defensive tool to say, hey, studying you, here's the type of threat vectors that we would think an adversary might direct against you that would have the highest probability of success. Whether that be, hey, you're a person who seems to love sports, you love, you know, the Lakers, or you love fill in the blank team. I think it's going to help us anticipate some of those things, and we can forearm and forewarn ourselves a little bit more.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this question is kind of on the kind of where do you see the things going? As cyber attacks get more complicated, will the focus on common attacks like social engineering or zero-day exploits go away?
I don't think they'll go away. It's interesting. So if we go back 10 years ago, like I can remember in my confirmation hearing before the Senate, the biggest question I kept getting from a cybersecurity perspective from the Senate was largely around 0 days. These are unique vulnerabilities in which the means to use the vulnerability to gain access to a network has never been known or discovered. And it theoretically offers you the golden key. Hey, the adversary doesn't know he has this vulnerability. And by using this capability, I'm going to exploit that vulnerability before the defender or network owner is ready to defend again. If you look at activity 10 years ago, you probably saw at its height, 70 to 75% of cyber activity was based around 0 days. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, I guess, in some ways, but it shows you where the state of cybersecurity is. That number's gone steadily down. Up until about 2 years ago, we actually had gotten to a point where 0-day vulnerabilities were about 10% of cyber activity. In the last year or two, you've seen them tick up again to about 20%. But to the previous question, you know, social engineering and the human dynamic is the weak point for access.
Yep.
Has proven to be very effective at scale and relatively low cost.
Yeah.
And therefore 0 days are nowhere near as prevalent as they were a decade ago, even though they've gone up a little bit in the last 2 years.
Okay. I think this is a related question. So how can organizations and companies then adopt emerging technologies to safeguard against cyber attacks? How can individuals protect themselves against phishing scams? Yeah.
So the first thing is, as users, every one of us has got to be increasingly skeptical. I mean, we have just got to stop thinking that every time we get an email, every time we get a link, every time we get an image, that we automatically have to respond. You know, one of the techniques I will use, for example, is if I am unsure of something, I'll say to myself, if it's something that I should really care about, they'll come back to me again. I'm just not, if I'm unsure, I'm just not going to automatically respond to what I'm seeing. You've just got to learn to be much more skeptical. Number two, we've got to, those of us that are operating systems, and you see this in a lot of commercial activities that will say, like when they go to multi-factor authentication, they'll say, hey, look, we would never send you an email that will ask you for your account information. We will never, you know, so if you get something that is asking for account or personal information that is purportedly from this bank or this institution, hey, it's invalid. We won't do that to you. That's not the way we work. So I do think there's a bit of education here for network owners as well. In addition, look, I always tell people when I talk to companies about, okay, Mike, so given all these challenges, how do I create an effective cybersecurity strategy? And what should it look like? And how do I know it's working? I always say, number one, step back and start with the basics. It's about the fundamentals, solid hygiene, okay? It's not about the most advanced technology. That it's a good thing, but it's not always the most important. Number one. Number two, the single greatest sources of compromises, as of right now, at least, are the human factor. So you got your potential greatest source of return in making the human factor much more difficult for an adversary to employ. And then lastly, we need to focus much more on cyber resilience than we are in cybersecurity. What is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity fundamentally is like, think about defending a castle. I want to make the walls taller. I want to make the walls thicker. I want to put a moat around the castle. I want to make that moat wider, deeper. Don't get me wrong, that is an important component of cybersecurity. But if all you're going to do is work on building a strong castle, then the challenge gets to be, once they're inside the castle, you're totally unready. That's where resilience gets to be so important. And I would argue cyber resilience needs to increasingly be a focus area for us. Resilience is this idea of, so what can I do to ensure my ability to recover in the face of a successful penetration? What can I do to make it harder for the adversary, for example, to extract information once they're on the inside? What can I do to make it harder for an adversary, once they gain access to my network, to laterally move around within the network? We need to spend more time doing that. And I can remember I worked for President Obama and President Trump and 2 or 3 secretaries of defense. And in each case, I told all of them, if the metric that you're going to use is, Mike, make sure no one ever penetrates a government system, I said it's just not a realistic metric. And I'm not a pessimist, and I'm not trying to make excuses, but as a guy who's also attacked for a living, sir, if that's the metric you're going to use, you're going to be very frustrated. I think a better metric is, Mike, show me not only how you're making it more difficult for them to be successful, but show me how you're making our ability to recover faster, better, stronger. You know,
Yeah, that's a different mindset. That's a different mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a totally different approach, resource strategy, prioritization. Yeah, it's very different. And I found it much more challenging to respond once and I have defended networks where unfortunately an adversary got in. We publicly acknowledged during my time in the Navy. The Iranians got into our unclassified continental United States network when I was a 3-star, and then when I was the 4-star commander for the department, the Russians got into part of our unclassified network in the Pentagon. So I have been in situations where I failed to keep them out and they got in. And I found the approach I had to use once the adversary was in the network, and I'm trying to drive them out and regain control, was totally different. Required a totally different leadership approach, totally different methodology.
Yep. Okay. There's a lot of really good questions coming in from the audience. Let's see. Okay, here's one. So you served as an NSA director during the first Trump administration?
Yes.
What insights can you offer about what President Trump might do with cyber and AI in his second administration? These issues certainly aren't going away. So
yeah, no. So I worked for President Trump, and I worked for the first 2.5 years of President Trump's first administration, and I worked for President Obama for the last 2 years of his second term. Two very similar individuals, very, very much alike when you dealt with them on a personal basis. That's humor. That's humor, everyone. They were very alike. Totally different people to deal with. This is one area where I was always frustrated during my time with the Obama team, who I have great respect for. They were working hard and they always wanted to do the right thing. I never questioned that for 1 minute, but I kept arguing. I don't understand why our adversaries think their being aggressive in cyber offers them more options with less risk. And yet we constantly tell ourselves that the use of cyber offensively is inherently escalatory. And given our high level of vulnerability, it just creates problems for us. The phrase I would always get, oh man, it used to drive me up the wall, is, Mike, we live in a glass house. And I said, can you tell me a nation in this digital world that doesn't live in a glass house? I mean, I can cite vulnerabilities in the Russian and the Chinese architectures if you want. I said, look, I don't understand why we're keeping this off the table as an option. I'm not arguing that it's always the right response, but don't you want me to at least be able to tee up options for you to consider? But they didn't. They just felt it was very escalatory. And so when President Trump came into office, I felt very strongly that we needed to relook our strategy. And I approached the secretary and the president and said, look, I think that we need to treat cyber as a tool. And like so many tools, you as the ultimate decision maker want a variety of options. Now, whether we use it or not, that's specific scenarios, specific event driven, but we should at least be willing to consider offensive cyber as an option. So during President Trump's administration, we changed our processes. He granted the organizations I led a whole lot more authority, and we were able to tee up a whole lot more options. The Biden team's walked back from that a little bit, and I fully expect that when President Trump comes in, he'll go back to that again because he felt very strongly about it. It was not a hard argument with him. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to make it sound like, well, this military admiral is just arguing, damn it, I want to hit them in cyber just like they're hitting us. That wasn't the point I was trying to make. The point I was trying to make was, I think we owe you as a decision maker a broader set of options, number one. And number two, I want an adversary to stop and think, hey, if I do this in cyber, are they going to try to do something like this against me? I said, I want them to be thinking about this. I want them to be thinking about us and maybe stepping back and reassessing. But right now, the way they're thinking is, hey, the Americans constantly talk about how they're not going to use cyber. The Americans constantly talk about how they consider this to be escalatory and therefore of excessive risk. And so it's something they're not even going to consider. It was almost like we were treating cyber like nuclear weapons. And I argued, look, we can be very precise in the application of cyber. It's not like a nuclear weapon. We can be very precise and very targeted, which we were able to show largely during President Obama's time. For the first time, we were granted authority really to use cyber offensively against adversaries. In this case, we picked ISIS as our kind of initial focus. And we're able to show, look, we can hit specific targets, no fratricide, no collateral damage. We'll hit only the targets that we talk about. And we learned so much. We developed a whole set of procedures, coordination, because there's a broad set of entities out there who need to be aware and involved in the decision to conduct cyber activities. I certainly fully endorse that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think people do talk about deterrence in the cyber realm, and it's I think we could have a whole discussion on what's
because we're utterly failing
or
in
common.
deterrence in cyber.
Yeah,
We're utterly failing right now
yeah,
in deterrence.
yeah, clearly. Okay, let's see. How can we increase the cost of attacks for our adversaries? This is important as we slowly have become normalized by being constantly, just to the deterrence thing, but normalized by being constantly attacked on the cybersecurity front. So what can we do to increase the costs? This is related.
So I very much agree. Before I talk about what we can do, one of my concerns is we increasingly are becoming numb to the whole thing. It just happens so frequently, so incessantly, and so significantly that we're almost numb to it now. And that's not a good place for us to be. We're becoming, in some ways, somewhat cynical about our ability to actually change this dynamic. So how might we change the dynamic? My first comment would be, could we move beyond economic sanctions as the end-all be-all for how to deal with this kind of behavior? Economic sanctions should be a component of what you're doing, but if that's your primary strategy, history to me would suggest that doesn't necessarily have a high probability of success. You take a look at, we told ourselves 3 years ago, we're going to implement the most effective, most significant, broadest, deepest set of economic sanctions that the Russians have ever seen, and we will relatively quickly be able to significantly degrade their economy to the point where they will be forced to reassess their invasion of Ukraine. We're coming up on 3 years since the second invasion, and how's that sanction strategy working out for us? Again, I'm not trying to argue sanctions shouldn't be a component, but to me, all too often we're defaulting to them as the end all be all, in part because there's something that you can do relatively easy to execute. I think we need to ask ourselves, what is it that the target really values? And because you're trying to deter by too broad parameters. I'm either trying to convince the adversary that their idea is not going to work. I'm going to make my network so strong, I'm going to make my network so resilient that the adversary isn't going to be able to be effective. They're just not going to be able to penetrate. They're not going to be able to extract. They're not going to be able to achieve the outcomes that they want. Or you say to yourself, I want the adversary to assess that, while he may be able to extract significant information, he may be able to generate significant money in terms of ransomware, but the pain that we're going to inflict as a result of that, if you're on the other side, you think, I'm not sure I want to pay this level of a price to achieve this outcome. And at the moment, they aren't paying much of a price. So I think we need to start by asking ourselves much more, not what we can do easily, like sanctions. What is it the target really values? As a military guy, we would say, what are the centers of gravity for this target? And how might I bring pressure to bear against those centers of gravity?
And you're not just highlighting cyber attacks in response.
Cyber is just one dimension.
Yep.
And then how do I bring a broader set of nations to partner with me on this?
Yep. Hey, there's a series. Yeah.
No, go ahead, James.
There's a series of questions on threat. So there's a question on China, there's a question on North Korea, a question on Russia. And I guess I'm going to try to group them together. And, China, we just talked about the penetration into the communications companies, discussion of Russia influencing the US election. North Korea had major cyber attacks in the past. How do you think about these different threats? Do you think about priorities or like evolution?
Well, they all have slightly different focus or priorities for cybers. If you're the North Koreans, for example, when you look at them, they tend to view, from a US perspective, they tend to use cyber predominantly, not solely, but predominantly as a tool to overcome their isolation. So they're the only nation state I've ever seen who has uses cyber from a national or state perspective to rob banks, to mine cryptocurrency, to try to break into gambling sites. I mean, they really use this as a tool to try to steal money. Now they do other things, don't get me wrong, but uniquely, I've never seen another nation in the world that uses cyber to steal money the level they do. The Russians, they traditionally have viewed this through the lens of both military capability. Hey, how can I develop cyber in a way to inflict potential military pain on an adversary, as well as defend my own ability to withstand those similar kind of pressures from the United States and others. Second, and these aren't on priority, second big thing we always watch them was espionage, spying. And the third, and this is where they're probably more different than the others, a huge misinformation, cyber as an extension of a massive disinformation and misinformation effort. If you look at the Chinese, they tended to focus on the theft of intellectual property. Cyber is a tool to steal intellectual property as part of a national strategy. Now you've watched them in the last few years get into cyber as a tool to place national security infrastructure at risk in the event of potential crisis or conflict. And also you've seen the Chinese start to get more into the influence, misinformation, disinformation dynamic. Lastly, the Iranians, the other nation state that generally we always tended to focus the most on, they so far historically, they have been the most aggressive probably in the destructive use of cyber. If you look at what they have done against oil and natural gas infrastructure in the Persian Gulf, if you look what they have done after going after water and infrastructure in Israel, for example, they've probably tried to use cyber more destructively than almost any other nation. Very aggressive about it.
Yeah, so it does seem China's sort of stepped up their game quite a bit.
They always had scale, but increasingly they're combining scale with significant capability and ability, combined with this risk idea where they are just more aggressive. They're willing to do things that traditionally I would have thought they would have considered too risky.
Are they sharing lessons between each other?
We would always talk about that. During my time, what we observed was they would certainly talk about, but we didn't see them necessarily sharing a lot of tools. They seem to have discussions about what's working, what's not working, but we didn't often watch them get into specific technical exchanges about, hey, use this strategy, use this kind of capability against this network configuration. We didn't normally see that. That's changing a little bit these days, but
okay, I want to be
even amongst those friends.
Yeah.
You know, there is always, most nation states protect their cyber capabilities, whether it's penetration for a variety of reasons or destructive, offensive kinds of things. Most nation states keep those very closely held, even among their friends and allies.
Yep. Okay. I'm gonna squeeze in one more question. I do want to be mindful of your time and the audience's time. Squeeze in one more. So and this is a good wrap up. In your opinion, does AI technology possibly give malevolent non-nation state actors tools that put it more on equal footing with the capabilities of a nation state? Or would the size and scale of resources of a nation state still be equally overwhelming today?
I think potentially technology becomes a great equalizer, which means it gives, and the fact that it is so broadly available, it's not controlled by nation states. It's not AI and other technologies we find in the world today are so broadly prevalent. It's one of the challenges of cybersecurity itself. It's a set of commercially developed technologies, the techniques of which are broadly made available on the dark web, the internet. Unlike building a traditional military where you need years to do it, you need a high level of money to do it, and you need a significant commitment over time. Cyber and technology are both great equalizers. None of those are applicable. You don't need necessarily billions of dollars. You don't need tens of thousands the people, and you don't have to give yourself, 2 to 5 years to create a military or a military capability.
Hey, so I want to hand it back over to Richard. I personally want to thank you, Mike, for just sharing your insights with me and the audience. I mean, there is
James,
no
thank
better
you.
person than you on this convergent topic. And I hope people appreciate what a challenging problem this is for our nation and for nations across the world and companies across the world, in fact. So thanks again, Mike. Really appreciate
No,
it.
thank you. Thanks to our audience as well. And
Yeah.
stay safe out there in the
Yeah.
broader LA arena right now.
Wow, what a great discussion. James, thank you for squeezing the last question in. That was a really good one. And I honestly feel like a villain for stopping this questions. This was really from the audience particularly, as well as your questions. This was just a fabulous discussion. And I just in this environment, we're a poor nonprofit, but we have a very important mission in this environment where we have so much on both sides that you only hear about in this polarized political environment we're living in these days. Platforms like the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, we're nonpartisan. It's this kind of a discussion where we can focus on critical issues like cyber, like AI, in a way that's not partisan. It's just hitting at this, getting information to allow our audience to make their own decisions, to understand these things. And I just can't thank you both enough for this wonderful discussion. Before I thank you formally, though, I do want to thank our audience. Great questions, and thank you for being with us. Once again, I apologize for the inconvenience that we were not able to do this in person today because of the fire and smokes at RAND, but I look forward to doing this again in the future. Once again, if you would like, we'll be happy to refund your ticket or give you a voucher for some of our upcoming programs. I hope you'll go to our website. We really have some great programs coming up. High school program at Caltech on the 24th, the Syria program next week, Dan Schnorr, a number of others, Chief McDonald coming up, as well as the Consular Corps reception. But if we operate based on donations, this is how we live. We live or die and bring conversations like folks with Admiral Rogers and Dr. Chow based on your donations. If you're in a position to do so, we would appreciate you donating, contributing in some way. Every little bit helps. If you go to the chat, you'll see there's a link to it, or you can go to our website where there's a donation button. But we really would appreciate it and can't thank you enough for doing that. But finally, let me once again, Admiral Rogers, it is such a pleasure to have you here. Dr. Chow, wonderful discussion, and I can't to express how much we appreciate knowing that you and your family were evacuated. For you to be here is just enormous, and it's the dedication. We just can't thank you enough. But all of us, let's leave with the thought. Los Angeles is just ravaged by fires. I just heard that recently that the framework of the evacuation warnings are increasing. So please, let's keep our hearts and our thoughts with all those folks who have not only evacuated, like Dr. Chow and his family, but lost their homes. Many are injured, and we just pray that the winds will die down and that we can get control of this. But again, thank you, Admiral Rogers, Dr. Chow. Thank you all. Thank you very much for being here tonight, and to our audience, thank you for being with us, and we really appreciate all you are. Have a good night to everyone. Thank you.